Okay, hello everybody. It is so lovely to see so many people here. I'm Rose. I'm one of the Spiritual Youth for Reproductive Freedom co-organizers and one of the moderators of this webinar. We're so excited to have you all here, and I'm going to get us started. So the idea for this webinar kind of came about as we were doing Spiritual Youth for Reproductive Freedom, or SYRF, organizing. SYRF is the preeminent organization for young people engaging in spiritually based pro-choice activism. An intersectional organization, we provide fellowship and organizing opportunities on academic campuses across the country. Through education and action, we are building the next generation of compassionate pro-choice leaders. If you're interested in starting a SYRF chapter, visit rcrc.org/SYRF and fill out the form at the bottom of the page. And during this meeting, when we were talking about SYRF, oh yes, this is the SYRF mission statement. And also at the bottom of this slide, you can see there's a link, which is the same link I just read aloud. So it's www.rcrc.org/SYRF. So visit that link if you are interested in getting involved. We would be so excited to have more chapters. So we were talking about this at a meeting, and we were talking about, it was after a school shooting had happened, and we were talking about how we had all grown up with gun violence in our lives, and particularly gun violence within our schools. And now, of course, all of the SYRF organizers are working in a field where gun violence impacts day-to-day functions of pro-choice nonprofits and abortion clinics. And we wanted to provide a space through the Religion and Repro Learning Center to both honor and mourn those who came before us, to discuss the realities of gun violence in the lives of youth. Having been dubbed the Massacre generation by some, Gen Z and SYRF organizers more specifically know that if there continues to be no action, more youth will needlessly die from gun violence. We are excited to engage the broader population through this webinar and discuss how gun violence impacts the lives of youths and abortion workers today. And I know that there are many young people here, and there are probably also middle-aged and senior people here. And we're excited to both engage with the knowledge and lived experience of young people, as well as the older people who are here. So moderating this webinar will be myself. I'm Rose Miller, along with my co-organizers, Margaret Valto, you want to raise your hand, Margaret, and Anaya Badger, you want to raise your hand? Awesome. And we are also the three main student organizers on the national level. So I'm going to start with Anaya. Anaya is a student at Berea College in Kentucky, majoring in psychology and peace and social justice. She draws on her background as a Quaker and her wide variety of experiences in different religious communities. She serves her community as a student chaplain and in various nonprofit organizations. And Margaret is a senior at Oberlin studying religion and gender, sexuality and feminist studies. She was recently hired as an outreach worker for a reproductive justice organization in Kentucky. She was raised in the United Church of Christ and Quaker traditions and believes faith and justice are inherently entwined. She hopes to do master's work in global health in the future. And I am a senior at Wellesley College, majoring in religion. I am the founder and a student organizer at SYRF. Having grown up both Catholic and Jewish, I draw inspiration from feminist and liberation theology in my own spiritual practice. I also dance West Coast swing and play classical guitar. So now I am going to turn it over to Margaret to talk a little bit more about the specifics of this session and lead us into some of the bios for our 5 amazing speakers. Margaret, you go ahead.
Thank you so much, Rose, and hello, everybody. I am so grateful that everyone is here. So this webinar is intended to be the first of two parts, with the second happening probably the week of April 11th. The date has not been settled yet, but it's somewhere in that week is our intended range. Our second session will actually be workshop based. So this one is going to be panels, and then workshop based next time, where we're going to split everyone into groups based on demographic information that we receive, and we'll provide some resources for doing this work in your communities. So if you are interested, you can go to the same form that Rose mentioned earlier on the SYRF website to sign up, and we will email you about the next webinar information. If you are going to miss any part of this webinar or want to listen to it again afterwards, you are in luck. It is being recorded, and you can find the recording on RCRC's Religion and Repro Learning Center website at rcrc.org/learning-center. The next webinar after today will be on March 23rd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and it's entitled Someone You Know. It'll feature a conversation with author and producer Asha Daya about her new documentary film of the same title. Someone You Know explores the challenges of abortion care, the impacts of shaming, and the morality gap. And thank you. This is our slide on the information for the Religion and Repro Learning Center. There are other webinars available there for your perusal. I highly suggest you check it out. So today we are excited to have 5 amazing speakers. Our first speaker is Victor Asal. Victor is the director of the Center for Policy Research and a professor of political science at the University of Albany, SUNY Albany, and the co-creator of the Big Allied and Dangerous Data effort. His research focuses on violent non-state actors, or VNSAs, pedagogy, and political discrimination related to ethnicity, gender, and sexuality.
Excellent. Our second speaker is going to be Faria Tavakoli, who's a sophomore at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, majoring in public health and minoring in neuroscience. She's passionate about the intersections of public health and neurology and hopes to aid low-income communities in her own city and beyond borders to ensure mental well-being, eliminating health disparities. Thanks for joining us, Faria.
Our third speaker is Bex Heimbrock, who is an award-winning activist, writer, and first year at Whitman College, where they are studying philosophy and race and ethnic studies. Their advocacy focuses on the intersections between gun culture, structural and carceral racism, and reproductive justice, and they work as a part of Advocates for Youth, Free the Pill Youth Council. So thank you, Bex, for joining us as well.
Yes, our third speaker will be Essence Ellis, and they're a recent graduate of Yale's Divinity School, where she received her Master of Divinity. A native of Charlottesville, Virginia, Essence works at the intersection of theology, public health, and women's rights. She's excited to be serving on the UCC's Council for Health and Human Service Ministry staff, working remotely from Chicago, Illinois.
Excellent. And our final panelist is Nima Rahman, who is a neuroscience senior at the University of Texas at Austin. Her interests include medical humanities and education, addiction and substance use and mental illness, higher education, and LGBTQIA+ health. She is especially passionate about the integration of the narratives of patients in primary care settings to improve treatment methods. And with that, we're going to jump right into the panelists because we have a really full night. So I'm going to hand it over to Margaret to start with Victor.
All right. Hello, Victor. Thank you so much for joining us. So can you discuss domestic terrorism in recent years? I know this is your forte.
I certainly hope I can. So I will note that I've done a lot of research on political violence internationally and domestically, but also a lot of research on discrimination and against various groups, ethnic groups, religious groups, sexual minorities, and women. And a lot of this stems from life experience If anybody is interested in any of my articles or talk more about this, I'd be happy to talk and share my academic articles as well. I'm a big believer that the more you can share information, the more useful it is. And the focus of my talk is going to be on extremists' turn to violence in the US. Can everybody see my PowerPoints? Okay, so this research was funded by the National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education Center, which was funded by the Department of Homeland Security. And so one question, the question we start with here really is, why do extremist organizations turn to violence in America? There are lots of extremist organizations that don't use violence, but there's been a growing threat of terrorism in the United States, specifically by Americans. And a lot of that has been driven by white supremacists, anti-Muslim people, anti-government extremists on the far right. And you can see, and please note that I wouldn't take the 2021 level because that really this was not done by the end of the year. Look at 2020, and you can see that political violence by these different groups is really rising in a way that is very scary. Do we agree that this is scary? Yes? So why might this be happening? And there's some various potential components here. Ideology, some ideologies tend to be more violent. So for example, in my previous research, religious extremists tend to be more violent than far right or far left extremists cross-nationally. Behavior, sometimes you're in a situation where the right behavior is the choice for violence. The rhetoric that people are using, the demonization they have of other people, or organizational characteristics, the size of an organization, the makeup of the organization. So we're looking to see which of these factors might be having an impact. Now, to answer this question, funded by the Insight Center, myself and my colleague, Suzanne Whedon-Levy, worked on a grant to collect data on a selection of extremist organizations. We didn't have enough money to collect it on all of them, but we did have money to collect on 87 organizations, a sample of 87 organizations from 2013 to 2019, although I will note that not all 87 organizations existed every year. That changed over time. And our key dependent variable, and I'm going quickly because I don't want Margaret Rose and Anaya to beat me up, our key dependent variable is whether or not they're using violence in that specific year. And I should note that there were 23 years out of 567 years where a hate group used violence. And we did this with our dependent variable being a binary variable. So either a 0 or a 1, they didn't or they did. The independent variables, which I can discuss during questions more, that we decided to use are they targeted by regional law enforcement, right? So if Rose is smacking Margaret, Margaret might want to smack back. Are they providing social services? So if they're being something that might be seen as governmental, would that have an impact? And that does for international organizations. Providing charities, and then different ideologies. So separatist ideologies, rightist ideologies, religious ideologies. I included gender exclusive ideology because I've seen that in other analyses in the Middle East having a big impact on the use of violence. Organizational size, whether they had an established armed wing, their leadership structure, and whether they were cell networked organizations. And because I need to finish in a minute, I'm going to go directly to our actual findings. Interestingly, if they're being targeted by regional law enforcement, they are almost 19% likely to be using violence. Now, this could be a circular effect, but still, even when I've done it in various ways, that can start them starting to use violence. The ideology that has the biggest impact is rightist ideology. If they are right-wing, they have a 7% likelihood of using violence. If they're separatist, they have almost a 3% use of violence. Violent rhetoric, if they're saying we're going to be violent, they're 2% more likely to be violent, which is interesting in its own right, because you'd think if they were saying it, they would be doing it. but they're only doing it more 2%. If they're bigger, they're 2% more likely. And actually, this is interesting. If they're providing social services, they are about 1%, almost 1% less likely to be doing this. And I have done this in the right amount of time. Correct, ladies? I'm done.
Thank you so much, Victor. If you have any questions on Victor's presentation, please put them in the Q&A box. We will address them during the audience Q&A later. Now I will pass it off to Rose and Faria.
Wonderful, yes, and make sure to upvote the questions in the Q&A box that you most want to be answered. So, Faria, can you talk about the present day implications of 9/11 on Muslim students and more broadly kind of your presentation and what it addresses?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that mine is not as analytical as Victor's, which was amazing, but I believe that it'll help serve as like a great colloquial discussion in regards to Muslim youth in the United States and their identity. So I will share that right now. I don't know. Can you all see my screen? Awesome. So first I wanted to really break down the actual response from 9/11. I do believe that this is something that people might be aware of, but I think continuously needs reiteration just because there's so much confusion in regards to it. After 9/11, clearly there was indicated hatred and hate crimes that increased among Muslims within the United States. Brown University actually saw that hate crimes targeting Muslims increased by 500% from the years 2000 to 2009, just through 9/11. But we also saw specifically how the government was also enabling this kind of discriminatory effort just through surveillance programs. Specifically, we all know about the Patriot Act and how that gave leverage towards governments and police agencies, for example, to discriminately use surveillance categories on Muslim businesses, individuals, community leaders, religious leaders, mosques, and etc., to portray that they would be a clear and indicative threat. And throughout the 2000s, we could see that discrimination and bullying were common impacts as well for Muslim youth. And this would actually translate as they grew up later on. But we also see that 20 years after 9/11, there specifically hasn't been a lot of change in regards to how we view Muslims, which is kind of unfortunate. There's continuous perpetuation of Islamophobia that is rampant throughout communities, and still the continuance of violence that is existent. Even with current polls, most Americans actually view that Islam is a current threat throughout their cities and a threat to the nation. And some of these actually have to do in regards to what we see currently in the media and the continuous violence that is happening among Muslim individuals, which ultimately leads to what I like to call the Muslim youth identity crisis in America. So one, media portrayal of Muslim youth, although it has increased over the years, it's not necessarily has increased in the quality or in the validity of the stories that we're presenting. Most portrayals have long perpetuated negative connotations among being Muslim. One has been portraying honor killings happening throughout families that practice Islam, youth going into extremism and terrorism. One idea is that Islam cannot be integrated within communities and is against national values within certain countries. But also something that we also see very prevalent is this idea that if youth deny certain values, it equates to a sort of freedom, which is really prevalent in the story of the quote unquote oppressed Muslim girl narrative, especially among hijabis within various forms of entertainment media that is present. But we also see an increase and this continuation of violence even after 9/11. And what's interesting to see is that as much as people think that they're only verbal threats, there's a lot of gun violence that is also continuously being made among Muslim communities. The Pew Research Center actually reported that 91% increase is actually seen from anti-Muslim hate crimes just in the beginning of 2017, which was the rise of like the Trump era. So it really shows a devastating trend of populism within the devastation of Muslim areas and communities. And these are just some examples, as you can see, of gun violence or the threat of gun violence within Muslim areas and Muslim students in particular. And then, as you can see from FBI reports, that big spike is 2001, but we can still see the very increased leveling off towards 2017, which indicates the issue of violence amongst Muslims still being prevalent. And this raises the question, I think, which is really controversial when we talk in Muslim communities, of if there's ever like a reinforcement of guns, in which some members of Muslim communities have actually stated that the proliferation of this gun violence has led for families to actually opt for gun use, which is obviously perpetuating gun violence even more because now we have more guns. But in legitimacy, the lack of protection, not only on an individual standpoint, but a political standpoint, the fear of violence and the need for self-defense are really good reasons into why members of communities try to protect themselves with the use of guns. However, ethno-religiously, we also see that many Muslim families don't have guns yet and will refuse to have it just for the reason that it is part of religious context not to be transgressive. And I use this quote, fight in the way of Allah, those who fight you but do not transgress, indeed, Allah does not like transgressors. So the use of guns has also been a controversial issue that's only gained traction among the Muslim community in recent years, which I think is really important to understand in terms of identity. And this ultimately is what I like to call the Muslim youth identity crisis, where many Muslim youth in America seem to have this broken mentality from the culmination of aspects of violence and threats that are perceived throughout their lives. So persecution, hostility, the continued sense of Islamophobia and discrimination, whether that be based on a workplace sense or even at school, and even the broadening pandemic with all the mental health tragedies that we see, it has led to certain identity problems within Muslim youth, especially when their identities are viewed as exclusive of one another. If you're too Muslim, you're not American enough. If you're too American, you're denying your Muslim identity. And we also see that masjids or mosques are also moving away in urban communities that have a lot of gun violence. And obviously, there is currently a lack of research in regards to what the main reason is, but it indicates that there's certain trends in regards to safety and Muslims definitely developing their own communities. But in regards to this identity crisis, there comes a need of families always telling youth that they have to be the voice of communities and fix negative portrayals of Islam that is already currently prevalent, which leads to this issue of being an advocate while at the same time trying to care for their safety. And when we talk about this in general, considering intersectionality is incredibly paramount. So Black Muslims in urban communities will have disproportionately more difficulties than other counterparts, and that goes the same with Muslim youth that are girls and might experience gender-based violence with guns. And ultimately, all of these need research because they're not really extensive enough, but that is an issue that we can obviously try to aim and fix. So one aspect is always the promotion of discussion and education, that us as Muslims and Muslim youth have the power to utilize our voices and go into areas that, although may be unsafe, also provide a voice and viewpoint that isn't necessarily within communities. We also see when Islamic organizations realize that gun violence is not exclusive to their issue and is actually an integral part of keeping Muslims safe in the United States, we can aim to stop targeting and try to keep our societies and our families safe. We also see that more lobbying and advocacy in terms of gun policy and hate crime laws is really necessary, especially in regards to how one North Carolina man did not get charged with a hate crime after he killed 3 Muslim college students, for the sake that North Carolina had very restrictive rules in regards to what they classified as a hate crime. So it's really important that we protect members of a community that are actually being attacked with hate crimes and extending those kinds of definitions so that they are engaged in safe interactions. And then it's also about reimagining Islam, which is really part of the Muslim youth identity. If the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that mobilization through social media has been a great tool. And Muslim youth have definitely been redefining and broadening the aspects of Islam through reproductive justice, through LGBTQIA+ rights, and showing members of community that current perceptions of Islam are not what youth currently consider Islam today. And that expression of storytelling will only help the community better. And I would not want to be on a panel if I couldn't share just a few experiences of Muslim youth throughout the United States. So I'm just going to read like 1 or 2 because time, but I think they're really important stories when we consider the impact of violence on the identity of Muslims around the nation. So one person stated to me, even after 9/11, some of my friends and family members could not stop at a gas station alone. My aunt was filling up a gas tank when someone threw a beer bottle at her face and yelled threats. And then another one also reads, I remember there was a Netflix storyline where Muslim girls are oppressed and forsaking your religion is liberation, not representation. That makes me safe. And then finally, Muslim families generate communities for a need to all stay together and not be exposed to other communities. But I felt that always went against what America stands for. It's either you lose your faith and identity or you're isolating people in effort to be safe. And those were just some of the examples that I wanted to share today. But thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Faria. That's so moving, the first person account, and what a comprehensive presentation. Thank you so much. So we are going to move directly from that to Bex. So Bex, can you elaborate on the impact on violence on Gen Z and specifically their bodies and bodily harm?
Of course. First, can I just get a verification in the chat that everyone can hear me and see me okay? Because my Wi-Fi is cutting in and out Just want to make sure I'm not cutting in and out for other people. Okay, wonderful. So I will go ahead and share my screen. And let's see, here we go. Put it in slideshow mode. All right, and just triple checking the chat that, all right, cool. I'm sorry, I'm like trying to look past all these little alerts that I'm getting because I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so the topic that I want to discuss with you guys is legislative violence and bodily disposability. I want to kind of interrogate the idea that an entire generation can be disposable. So, all right, there we go. In order to understand and interrogate these power structures, I think that we need to start with a few definitions that I have been using in this presentation. So there's first the idea of productive power, which sort of is coined by Michel Foucault, the idea of biopower, which imagines power as a web of relationships whose primary concern is the reproduction of life. So we can see this when a doctor, as a facet of the medical institution, a site of power, refuses to perform a hysterectomy on a woman of reproductive age. So in this sense, power is exerting control over a reproductive woman's autonomy, bodily autonomy. So this kind of feeds into the idea of bodily control. And then we have this idea of the zone of non-being and necropolitics. So this is coined by Achille Mbembe, an amazing philosopher. But essentially the idea is that bodies are so strictly relegated through socio-political power that they have all autonomy stripped away and as such become neither living nor dead. An example that Mbembe includes is like that of the Palestinian or really anyone in an apartheid state where they're so heavily subjugated that their autonomy is gone. They don't have a social life. I mean, you know, their heart is still beating, but they don't have a social life. At the same time, they're not 6 feet in the dirt, right? So it's this idea of like the zone of non-being, and that's going to become very important later on in the presentation. So just make a little note, if you will. And this kind of goes to my greatest concern. I don't know if I think I'm having a little trouble moving to the next slide. There we go. So when talking about legislative violence, I think it's also important to talk about the American dream. There is a song, America the Beautiful, that is taught in a lot of elementary schools. America, America, may God thy gold refine, till all success be nobleness, and every gain divine. So we have kind of in these lyrics, the idea that movement is tied with autonomy and wealth. When you have wealth, you have movement. When you have movement, you have autonomy. So how does the law use this to subjugate bodies, right? So for reproductive bodies, we see that in 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that any employer with a religious or moral objection can opt out of covering contraceptives in employee health plans. This hits on the issue of wealth, as people who can't afford contraceptives without insurance are SOL. And in 2021, the Supreme Court again upheld Texas Senate Bill 8, which prohibits abortion past the 6-week gestation period, but more importantly, penalizes abortion providers and anyone accused of aiding and abetting abortion via tort law. So essentially, anyone who is accused of this can be sued for damages of minimum $10,000. That is a massive financial fine. So this goes directly to the idea that you can control someone's autonomy if you can control their wealth. By levying economic sanctions against women, you are really strictly tying down their movement because you're denying their autonomy, if that tracks for everyone. So one thing that helps me is thinking about the growth of the American suburbs, right? Why did the suburbs come about? And of course, this is a very like condensed thing, a recapping of the suburbs, but you have this situation where mostly white people are getting a lot of money. So they're able to leave the cities and be in a place with like fresh air and more lawns. So this is movement, this is autonomy, this is wealth. And this is something that is being taken away from women and from people with reproductive bodies, because obviously, as we know, not all people with uteruses are women. So I just want to pose a couple of questions, kind of a reverse Q&A, getting a little crazy, guys. But what are the implications of being denied mobility via legislative violence? You know, we have this flurry of legislation that concerns women and women's bodies and bodies of people with uteruses that is really restricting them. So in that sense, are we as a generation, because of this legislation, being disembodied from the American dream? And then what does that mean for us? And what does it mean for generations to come? And then, you know, kind of to the point of intersectionality, which I know has been brought up previously, can we think about who within Gen Z are most impacted by this legislation? You know, we know that 1 in 3 Latina and 4 in 10 Black women of reproductive age reportedly are unable to pay more than $10 for contraception. I mean, that's like a very stark fact for me, especially when we know that poverty is something that compounds. So with this being taken into consideration, I also want to ask if certain Gen Zers are relegated into this zone of non-being. And for this, I want to think about who we deem as worthy of life and worthy of death. I think we can find this in the difference in media coverage of school shootings in majority white suburbs versus disenfranchised communities. So statistics have shown that 1 in 4 Americans perceive mass shootings to be the greatest gun violence threat facing their communities. But this study that I'm citing, which I lost this citation, but I will throw it in the chat when I find it, showed that shootings with multiple victims occurred only 22% of the time. Yet they were covered, or they were almost 6 times as likely to make the news. So if we take it for granted that the media can be kind of considered as like fingering the pulse of what American society values, we're placing value on the lives of mass shooting victims who most commonly are white, as opposed to gun violence that doesn't center white bodies. So I think that it's really a question of placing value on bodies. So there's kind of this big power structure that relies on bodily disposability. And that's really kind of the main idea that I want to leave you guys with, is who is disposable and who is not. And then kind of on that note, who can fight and who can make change? That's another big question that has sort of been following me through my career as an activist. I've been an activist for about 5 or 6 years now. I think a lot of times Gen Zers like to say, oh, we're going to be, you know, the face of the revolution. Okay, well, what is revolting? What does it mean to rebel? Are we going to make concessions? Are we going to work within the power structures? I worry that that kind of creates the potential for more harm than good. In my opinion, trying to attempt an abolitionist or an abolitionist approach, I believe the ultimate goal might not be for lawmakers to create more progressive legislation, although that would be helpful and would be a form of harm reduction. But the need for such legislation to cease, the fact that someone is able to legislate bodily autonomy in the sense of reproductive rights, I think that that is something that really needs to be interrogated. And of course, this might not fully reconcile with different understandings of power, but if we can kind of shift that window of thought to kind of, well, why is this legislation even happening in the first place? I think that we can really move towards progress. So I know that that was a lot to kind of sit with, and I moved probably a little fast. Hopefully I didn't cut out for any of you guys. But with that, I will stop screen sharing and cede my time.
Thank you so much. That was a very informative and powerful presentation. Your Wi-Fi was great the whole time, so don't even worry about it. So my question for Essence is, can you discuss the intersections of violence, Christian supremacy, and reproductive freedom?
Yeah, definitely. Really excited to be here with y'all today. So I'm gonna jump right in, but before I start, I do have to warn y'all that I am unabashedly a manuscript gal, and I don't have any visuals today. So we can think of our next few minutes together as a nice little podcast. Feel free to rest your eyes, move away from the screen, whatever you need. The sound of my voice will still be here. So that's a great question. So when considering the intersection of violence, religion, and women's rights, there's no one place to really land. So my thoughts today are formed from experiences I've had in my own life and those I've witnessed or been privy to based on the communities that I participate in. And so when thinking about this panel today off the dome, I couldn't nail one starting point because in my brain, issues of violence, religion, and women's rights are deeply mixed. So for the science folks out there, I mean a homogeneous mixture. And for the not quite sciencey folks like me, that means the individual elements can no longer be separated from the mixture. That is to say, when we're in conversation about violence, we must, no matter how frustrating, accept and work with all the sticky little nuances. That's also to say, there's no way I can account for the fullness of this intersection in about 7 minutes. So I'm fully aware that there's a lot more ground to cover. And so I decided a great place to kind of begin was figuring out what definition of violence I wanted to work with, or better yet, what definition accounts for the working definition I've assumed over the years. And you would genuinely be surprised just how many definitions there are out there on the interwebs. So shockingly, the American Psychological Association defines violence as, quote, an extreme form of aggression, such as assault, rape, or murder, end quote. And as a Black woman, that was deeply unsatisfactory, considering I'm pretty sure the fear, which was really deep, that I felt on my very white and very conservative undergrad campus when Donald Trump won the 2016 election was a reaction to violence. The sudden display of Confederate flags that were once hidden in closets, or the anonymous hate-filled letters sent to the Student Engagement Center complaining about the recent establishment of safe spaces, those instances and many more were violent, even though I was not physically harmed. So thankfully, the World Health Organization, who I kind of vibe with, they define violence as, quote, the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. Very lengthy, yes, but holistic and necessary. And it's important that a definition of violence is holistic because we live in a country founded on the genocide of Native people and the enslavement of Black people. But many will argue that because none of the Native people alive are actively experiencing explicit genocide, and none of the Black people alive are actively being enslaved, that the violence has ended. But we know that that's not true, because Native women around the country are disappearing or being murdered at an alarming rate, despite reservations or geographic areas that are highly populated by Native folks being overly policed. And Black women, as a demographic relative to our percentage of the population, are the most educated in the country, but our wealth and salaries don't reflect that, which makes it difficult to access rent, health insurance, or any of the other basics in life, which, you know, can get a little sticky. So, in the words of our good brother Marvin Gaye, what's going on? And so what's going on is, unfortunately, we're experiencing the results of a country that has an innately violent culture paired with a government driven by patriarchal capitalism. A prime example of this, the Violence Against Women Act expired 3 years ago, and elected officials only recently reached a deal to move forward after the bill sponsors dropped a proposed gun safety provision. That provision would have prevented unmarried partners from keeping guns if they were found guilty of violence against a dating partner. Now, this is so deeply insidious because, according to an article in the American Journal of Public Health, the risk of a woman being killed increases 5 times when a gun is present in a situation of domestic violence. That's one of the legal aspects. But we have to consider who are the people that have access to guns, right? Because it's not the guns, it's the problem, it's the people who have guns, or what they do with them. And so how are people shaped by cultural norms? And that's kind of like a huge part of this conversation, because, you know, people do the doing. And so especially when so much of our media portrays women as the direct victims of violence without consequence for the perpetrators of that violence. Everything from how sex workers are treated in GTA, to the tropes of thoughtless women in horror movies, to the lack of representation of trans women, period, which alone is violent, because completely disregarding trans women has left them invisible and marginalized, not only in our daily lives, but in the justice system, which has empowered a lot of people, cishet men in particular, to feel invincible when they're violent toward trans women. And so, caveat, I mentioned media because women can't even find solace in fiction, because violence against us is so normalized and expected that many people are desensitized to it. But what's really concerning are the narratives used to justify that violence. And so I come from a very churchy background. I'm a church girl. And the amount of faith leaders that are domestic violence apologists is absolutely atrocious. I've heard women recount stories of pastors who have blatantly called them bad wives, accused them of instigating their husbands to violence, told them to pray to God to ask how they, the victim, can help their husbands be less violent, and ended their horrible excuse of pastoral care by implying that divorce isn't an immediate answer. Of course, all of these horrible hot takes are grounded in very questionable theologies. Patriarchal theologies that uplift men as head of their households and view men as necessary authoritative figures in society in general, which is just not true. And the way this kind of circles back around is that the United States is a Christian nationalist country. Even with church attendance dwindling and younger generations leaning more towards identifying as spiritual, the remnants of oppressive theologies can be identified all throughout our cultural norms. And recent news, this can be seen in the ongoing discourse around reproductive freedom and how people without uteruses, people who aren't the primary caretaker of our youth, people who often happen to be cishet men, use their power and or money to influence power policy regarding reproductive services with no concern for the practical outcomes, just personal moral theories projected onto other people. And so this is why it's imperative that faith leaders of any age across all religions join these broader conversations around reproductive health, violence against women, and to break binary, violence against any marginalized group with conviction and dedication. Because women, queer folks, humans across the globe are just not being treated well. And despite adherence to traditional religions declining, all sacred spaces should be safe. Women, LGBTQIA folks, Black and brown folks should be able to turn to sacred spaces and know that they can heal from violence peacefully in those spaces. And of course, curating a space or environment for healing and access to resources that people desperately need, i.e. abortions, because they might be illegal in some states after June, won't be easy. And let's honestly keep it a stack. It may not be legal, but it is just. Because even if the government, state and federal, is being complete garbage, we shouldn't be. And that's probably going to be an ongoing gray area moving forward, but we have to remember that little bit I said earlier about nuances and things getting sticky, and we're going to have to keep that in our back pocket, because in order to move forward, to progress, to transform even, things are not going to be black and white. It's going to be very gray, and it's going to get very difficult. So that's all I really have for us today. But thank you for listening and sharing this time with me.
Thank you so much, Essence. And if you have questions for Essence, please put those in the Q&A, and we will make sure to get to them. Before I move on to Nima, I do want to mention that we are going to tack on a few minutes at the end, just because we have so many questions and we want to get to as many of them as possible. So we're going to probably tack on about 5 minutes to the end of the webinar. So having said that, Nima, can you discuss the intersections between Islamophobia, gun violence, and reproductive justice as well?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much for everyone who presented before me. Don't know how I'm going to follow all of y'all. I also do not have a presentation. So if you're feeling tired, please feel free to not look at me and just listen to my voice. But as Margaret mentioned, you know, I think it's been reiterated at this point that some of the most notable effects of domestic terrorism on Gen Z Muslims lies with this hate and heightened fear experienced by themselves as members of the Muslim community. And I think that that really exists plainly because most of Gen Z, if not all, exist in the backdrop of 9/11. That's something that I've personally had conversations with both my parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles about, from everything from, you know, myself as a Muslim, what I do, what I wear, how I act in regards to spaces, excuse me, such as, you know, the 9/11 memorial that I was just at, to, you know, how TSA now runs in the airport. You know, I think that it's pretty clear that there's an immeasurable change that's been made on our society because of that. And the reason that I emphasize that so much is because I think that for me personally, and this is strictly an anecdote, I have no memory of my life without 9/11. And I know that that feels really simple to say, but I think that that's not something that a lot of people older than me in my own experience have seen as a reality, because for a lot of people, they remember the moment 9/11 happened, or pre and post 9/11, just like I will remember pre and post COVID, you know, but for them, that's all that they've known. For me, that's all that I've known. And I think that that's important in regards to our discussion about gun violence, because there are ways in which Muslims fear gun violence, not necessarily in its physical way, but also anytime that there's any form of gun violence that happens in the United States. I know for me personally, and for many members of my community, the first thing that I think about is the victims. And the second thought that I'll tell you that comes through my head is, I really hope this person isn't Muslim. And the reason I mention that is because I think when there's any source of domestic attack that's perpetrated by gun violence, you know, in the United States, every time that gun violence makes the news, a lot of times, and you'll find that a Muslim person is, or, you know, someone who identifies as Muslim is the center of that conversation as the perpetrator. And it raises this question, and this is a rhetorical question that, you know, I don't know if I have the answer to, but I think is important to think about, is what is this collective apology that I need to feel that I have to make on behalf of my community every time, you know, a Muslim person is centered in the news, and especially, you know, in a negative way that I'm speaking of right now. What is this collective guilt that this entire community, this religious minority community in the United States, is feeling, especially considering the fact that they're already experiencing the brunt end of a lot of religious violence in the United States. And I also want to mention, you know, while I am Muslim, there are a number of communities that have been at the receiving end of violence that Muslim communities also face. For example, the Sikh community, especially right after 9/11, did receive a lot of this anti-Islamist violence as well, or they were recipients of it. And the reason I mention this is I think that America's like obsessive fear of Islam, of Muslims, of anything, you know, tangential to that area is really distracting all of us, including legislators, including grassroots organizers, about the real problem, which is gun control. And I think to necessarily conflate the two together isn't what needs to be done moving forward. And I think that it has a lot to do with how Muslims view themselves in the media at large, and why stereotypes continue to be perpetuated. Excuse me. Faria had mentioned earlier that there are not really a lot of changes in the way that Muslims see themselves in the United States, or the way that, you know, Muslims might be seen at large. And I think that this is really important when we talk about 9/11 as the backdrop for a lot of people, because, you know, for me, I know that I made the personal decision not to wear hijab out of fear. I don't feel good saying that, you know, that doesn't feel good to say out loud, but I did it because I was afraid. Like, there's no other reason for that. I'm still afraid. Like, that's just frankly how it is. And I hope that I move past that, but that's just something that I have to deal with. And I think it would be remiss for me to say that that's not a large experience for a lot of Muslims. And I think that it's important to think about, you know, gun violence as an issue at large in the context of reproductive justice. And I wanted to encourage everyone who's in the audience today to just remind themselves that even if that doesn't make any sense, why is gun violence related to reproductive justice? How do those two things make sense? That's not something that everybody on this panel, and frankly, myself, have all the answers to. Or on top of that, it's not something that we ourselves necessarily understood, you know, the minute we started thinking about activism. It's a growing and learning process. And for me, I started to do a lot of my own personal investigation about how is gun violence related to reproductive justice and why is it important to me as a Muslim? And the conclusion that I've at least settled on as of right now, that I think would be hopefully valuable to share with y'all, is that at its very bare minimum, at its bare bones, reproductive justice has this requirement that people are able to want and live and raise families in a safe, healthy community. That is the most general, that is the most bare bones, easy, simplistic definition that I could think of and that I could kind of conjure up. And I think if you think about, you know, in my own case as a Muslim, there's many Muslims, including myself, that hold a great deal of doubt towards our own abilities and towards our community's practical ability to thrive and create safe Muslim environments for the next generation of Muslim people that live in the United States, if Islamophobia continues to make targets of us and to make targets of our communities, because at some point there's only so much physical and emotional and mental trauma that a lot of communities are willing to face. And for a lot of people, especially for a lot of Muslim people who may intersect with other identities, such as being first-generation immigrants, for some people, there's only so much that they're willing to sacrifice in order to, you know, live the American dream, so to speak. And so the reason I bring that up is gun violence is a public health issue, and gun violence is first and foremost going to affect the way that we're able to live in healthy communities. And reproductive justice is also a public health issue that also affects the way that we're able to live in safe and healthy communities. And so I think it's really important for organizations and for people who are passionate about one issue or the other to consider maybe thinking about other issues that directly relate to the one you might be passionate about. If you're passionate about gun violence, then it's important to think about the ways in which your efforts can help and aid and support the reproductive rights movement, and vice versa. And I think that that's something that I'll be the first to admit I really never thought about, honestly, until maybe like 12 to 18 months ago, largely in regards to the fact that I live in the state of Texas. And so I definitely was not the most articulate as I had wanted to be in the time that I've spoken up here. But I really, hope that my personal experience and the tidbits that I've been able to share have resonated with somebody. And I really appreciate the time to be able to speak today. So that's going to be it for me.
Thank you so much. That was very powerful and just wonderful to hear. So now all our wonderful panelists, we have some questions from the audience, and the first one was asked by an anonymous attendee, and they have two questions. So the first is, how do we break this cycle of disregard for people's humanity? And their second question is, what do you think the long-term impact of reproductive decisions Gen-Zers might make?
People have been trying to change disregard for people's humanity for several thousand years. And I think that the efforts that we're seeing right here and people's efforts to make people inclusive are not going to make the problem go away, but can dramatically make things better. Okay, Nima, you don't remember before 9/11, but some of us are old enough to remember just when it was okay to treat certain people certain ways that would be completely unacceptable, right? I'll give you a brief example. My father was from North Africa, and he was a person of color. And on a regular basis, when I went to the supermarket, somebody would come up and get security to check because they thought my father was kidnapping me. And that would happen several times. And that would be a lot less acceptable today than it is then. My last name is Arabic. And after 9/11, for 3 years, I was randomly stopped every single time I flew. And I'm still occasionally randomly stopped, but it's not like it was after 9/11 when literally every time I flew, I was randomly stopped. So efforts, as we see here, and people standing up to discrimination and abuse can make things better, but it's not going to make it go away. Because it's unfortunately, if you go and read if you read Adam and Eve and on, there are elements of humanity that are not so great.
Can I pop in really quick on that too? I think it was Angela Davis who said something along the lines of like, I don't want to be in community with all of you. And so it's also a part of that is being able to identify specifically who you want to be in community with, and then deliberately making intentional choices to be in community with them, because everyone's not going to be great. And everyone's not going to last forever too. The community you want to be a part of now may not be the community you want to be a part of this time next year. And so it's also about kind of curating who you're surrounded around, which a lot of people kind of, they frown upon that, but there's no shame in that, quite honestly.
Oh, and speaking up, if you see somebody being treated like crap because of how they look or who they are, you have a moral obligation to speak up, and you should. And that might not always go nicely, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, that was very just insightful. Honestly, I totally agree. So my next question seems suited for you, Victor. It is, how do you explain the reduction of violence from the far left extremists in more recent years? And that was asked by one of our attendees, Kim.
And I talked the far left people out of it. That's what happened. No, so this is something that happens and has happened over the years, where different ideologies rise and fall. And if you'd had this question in the 1960s, the people to be scared of would have been the far left. And as ideologies grow and decline, they have different impacts. And right now, the far left is not really a group that people are joining in the same way that unfortunately they're joining the far right and separatist groups. And so it really are there waves of this.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Victor. The next question we have was also by an anonymous attendee, and I want to direct this at Bex, but also Faria and Nima, if you want to pipe up. I would love to hear what you have to say about this too. The question is, what strategies can Gen-Zers and the adults who love them utilize to increase hope, resilience, and agency, and decrease fear, overwhelm, cynicism, and helplessness?
Yeah, okay. I think this is the question that we're all asking ourselves. So also, like, please, like, shoot a message in the chat again if my audio or anything cuts out. As far as strategies go, I've been reading some really interesting books about queerness, just like queerness as in like subversive, as in practicing things that are sort of against heteronormative status quo. A big part of that is, and I think this kind of actually goes to Essence's point about being in intentional communities. So you can, there's this like queer idea of found families. So for Gen-Zers, for the people that love them, to be in a community of people that is intentional, that is based on love, that is, you know, based on hope, I find that to be a good way to kind of keep morale up. I'm from DC, and during the George Floyd uprisings, we kind of, you know, entered into intentional communities with each other. We called them collectives, but they were really just communities. And those people are some of the best friends that I have, and they keep me going when it, you know, looks like we're never going to actually be able to make change, and it looks like that a lot. But take solace in the people around you, I think, is what I would ultimately say to that. And you know, I think when you lead with love, it's a lot better than leading with anger, because anger is it can be destructive. It can be productive. It can also be destructive. So a little bit of a convoluted question or answer to a good question. And I will leave it at that.
I would just to tack on something that I have been thinking about just a lot recently has been like, why am I doing what I'm doing? Like, is there any point? That sort of just kind of thinking. And I think one thing that has, I don't know if made it all worth it even is the right way, but I think that it now more than I don't know if now more than ever is the best way to put it, but I think as a young person, it is so incredibly important to be surrounded by people. It doesn't necessarily have to be people your age, but just to be surrounded by people who not only believe in their own ideas that align with yours, but believe in you, because sometimes it's really difficult for us to believe in ourselves. And I think that this maybe is directed to the adults who love them. It can be really difficult to be in a world saturated with news. And I think to be able to distill yourself out of that can be quite hard. And so I think that it's important to remember that joy can also be a radical act of, you know, activism. It can also be something that's used because for a lot of people, your very existence in the space that you occupy is profound and is amazing in and of itself. And so I think that being able to find whatever it is that, find whoever and whatever it is that can at least keep you going in the long run on a day-to-day basis is really important. Yeah, and exactly what Essence is putting in the chat.
Yeah, I was just taking a second to read through that, but I have been reading those books for a while. It's incredible. Absolutely game-changing for anyone, really. So, I guess my next question, I would direct it toward Victor, but of course, as with all the questions, I encourage the panelists to answer them in the chat so that they could put their input in for the sake of time. But the next question is, how do we get legislators to break out of the political party platform and do what is morally right?
There can be a whole hell of a lot of them that aren't. Because some legislators are motivated by ideology, and in some ways that can be very good. But some legislators are motivated by ideology, and their ideology is that if you're not of a certain religion or a certain gender, you don't count. And getting those people, campaigning to get those people out of office is the key thing to do. For people who do care about people in a broader sense, then campaigning and talking to them and reaching out is going to make a difference. But unfortunately, a lot of politicians are focused on certain views, and the key thing to do to change the system is to get people who actually care about others to be the people who are elected. And a classic example of somebody who doesn't care about anybody else who got elected was Donald. And that is a clear example of somebody you could campaign and try and explain 40,000 times stuff to Donald, and Donald doesn't care. It's all about Donald. And I don't mean duck, I mean Trump.
Yeah, thank you so much. Something I think is really important, this next question, I'm going to direct it at you, Essence, is could you please stress the necessity of self-care as we help others deal with the current realities, and how do you do that, or how would you recommend doing that?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would start by saying that some of our notions of self-care are really just capitalism wrapped in really cute like bows and stuff. So like going on a shopping spree or like buying all your favorite sheet masks, those are really cool. I do all those things too. And they often aren't very sustainable, or they don't really fill ourselves or give ourselves the care that we're actually looking for. And so for me, self-care, especially in the last year, I've been a self-care person for like most of my 20s now, but in the last year, I've been more deliberate about indulging in self-care that feels like something that I can do for the rest of my life. And so for me, that has been like implementing daily practices that are almost like routine or religion, that kind of set the tone for my day. It doesn't have to be at any particular time of the day for me, but at some point I have to do them, be it like stretching or journaling or stepping away from my computer. But also self-care is sometimes really hard. So sometimes my self-care is like, all right, Essence, we're gonna spend 10 minutes answering those 10 emails that you didn't want to answer, because if you don't get them done, you might lose your fellowship. And so it's about kind of balancing the things in life, and also realizing that sometimes self-care, like it's not what you want to do, but what you have to do for yourself. And I know that that's difficult. I've suffered from chronic mild depression for a lot of my life. And so there are many things that I do not want to do, almost ever. And learning how to not go around it, but kind of go through it has been really helpful. And for me, it's really holistic. So there's like a spiritual element, there's a physical element, there's also medical professionals that have been really helpful to me in the last few years. And so just realizing that it's not always going to be butterflies and flowers, but the outcome will be helpful to future you.
I couldn't have said it better myself, honestly. So this next question I'm going to direct at Faria, but it's okay if you don't know if anyone else wants to jump in. Edna Bick asked just of any like social services provided, so I'm assuming meaning like around the topics we talked about, like repro health or just like gun violence or things of that nature.
Yeah, I really want to target this in like a Muslim youth like audience, because I think there's also a discussion of breaking certain perceptions of what Islam stands for and how youth are a paramount point in breaking those kinds of attitudes that are reinforced by the public that are not Muslim. But one resource I think that's really important for all Muslims, especially if they care about sexual health, for example, which is kind of stigmatized ethno-religiously, is Heart to Grow. I think they have amazing resources that focus on a Muslim lens and viewpoint. I also know in Texas, Nima can actually, I think, maybe like speak on this a little. There's DIA, which is really important in terms of reproductive health and justice, and all their efforts onto that, taking more of like a South Asian viewpoint and Islamic viewpoint. And I think like being a part of like those organizations are just really powerful for youth to know, because oftentimes I think Muslim youth don't know that reproductive health and justice are focuses, and there are services and areas and experts that can help you in that regard. And if you're like LGBTQIA+, like me and you're like Muslim, I guess like you could go and check like the queer like Muslim collective on Instagram, and you could see specifically and reach out to people who run their like organization and collective, because I think storytelling is also really important, like social service that we really kind of forget, that is incredibly paramount in autonomy. But yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that was incredibly helpful. This will be our last question, so if there are more questions you guys as panelists want to answer, feel free to type those out. But our last one, I'm going to direct at Bex, and it's what would be an impactful message to write for letters to editors in our local papers?
Yeah, okay. So, in my presentation, I talked a lot about, well, maybe not a lot, I touched on how important it is to move the window of conversation from reformism to abolition. So I think a really powerful and good topic, just like very general, broad topic to write op-eds for, would be the topic of abolition, the topic of what does it mean to be subversive? How can we enact that? How can we practice abolition? Kind of simple things like that. What I think is really powerful about op-eds is it gives you the ability to tie broader philosophical or theoretical issues into what's happening in your community. So look around you, take note of what is going on, and say, how do I take an abolitionist approach to this? And then just write about it. Yeah, op-eds are very empowering and fun, and can be really good for shifting the conversation to something productive. Good question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know there were a couple of questions that were directed at a couple people in the chat if y'all want to get to those, but I'll hand it over to Rose.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. I know I've learned a lot tonight, and I'm sure that everybody here has as well. I want to say a few things in closing. So first of all, thank you to our amazing panelists for enlightening us all and speaking, as one of the comments said, so eloquently about these really, really heavy issues. It's clear that not only have you done a lot of thinking about this, but you're going to be leaders going forward in the movement. And I would rather be led by no one else. I also want to let all of the attendees know that there will be a part 2 of the Massacre Generation webinar series happening in April, kind of reiterating what Margaret said earlier, where we will provide action items and a roundtable discussion with webinar attendees. If you're interested, be sure to sign up for the next webinar. If you are on the RCRC mailing list, you should get a reminder in your inbox. You can also find the link on social media at RCR choice closer to the date. I also wanted to give a quick reminder of the next webinar that is happening on Wednesday, March 23rd at 4 p.m. Eastern time, entitled Someone You Know. Asha Daya has dedicated her life to uplifting the stories of women, girls, and femmes whose lives are often forgotten, marginalized, or villainized. She takes us on journeys of abortion seekers featured in her new documentary film, Someone You Know. So if you would like to sign up for that, you can find the link at the Religion and Repro Learning Center. And thank you all so much for coming. I know I have had a really good time, and it's so lovely to not only see all of the wonderful faces of the panelists and the moderators, but also to see that the attendees were interested in learning things, and this is all wonderful. So bless you all and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.